Rather than configuring the same users on many different machines, we can keep a central list or directory of users on a server and configure clients to use that list to allow logins. This is called LDAP, or Lightweight Directory Access Protocol. In order to work, LDAP needs two components, a server and a client. These can be on the same machine, as I'll show you here, but in a production setup, you would have one server and then configure all of your clients to use it. During the setup of the client, we'll also need to reconfigure PAM, the Pluggable Authentication Module System, to allow LDAP to be an approved method of authenticating on the system. To set up the server, I'll first install two packages that we need, LDAP utils and slapd. LDAP utils has some tools that we'll use for interacting with LDAP, and the slapd package is the actual LDAP server. I'll write apt install LDAP utils and slapd. While we go through the installation, which is triggered automatically when I install, and can be run again with dpackage reconfigure slapd, I'll first enter an administrator password for the admin user in my LDAP directory. I'll confirm that, and the installation will continue. To continue the installation, I'll type dpackage -reconfigure slapd. I'll continue through this process, and I'll choose No for this prompt. I'll set the name of my domain to example.com. In production, you'd want this to match up with your fully qualified domain name. And for the rest of these, I'll put in appropriate values. It's asking me for the administrator password again, so I'll put that back in. And I'll choose MDB, I'll choose No, I'll choose Yes. I'll choose No to not allow the LDAP v2 protocol. And that's configured. Managing the server side of this is a little beyond the scope of this course. Directory services are not a trivial thing and need to be set up very carefully for production use. So ideally, you'll already have a server set up to bind clients to. But to make things easier on us to get started here, I'll install and configure a popular web tool for managing the server called PHP LDAP admin. We can interact with the server through the command line as well, but it gets pretty tricky, and for an example server, this tool will be easier to work with. If you start managing a directory more frequently, you can look into the LDAP modify tool and see how to use it at the command line or how to feed it large, properly formatted data files. I'll write apt install php LDAP admin. And that will go through and install a web server and PHP and the tool that we'll use to manage the directory. And then I'll open this up in the browser at my host address /php LDAP admin. And I'll log in with the password that I set for admin earlier. And here I can manage my directory. I'll add a group, or an OU, an organizational unit, called People. And that will contain my users. I'll commit that. I'll choose People, and then choose to create a child entry. That'll be a generic user account. I'll set the common name to Mary. The first name is Mary. And then I'll choose to put them in the People group. For the home directory, I'll just use home/users. And for the last name, I'll put in Green. I'll set a password, and I'll confirm it. And it's important to note here that the user ID is 1000. 1000 is the same as the first user on my system, so I don't want this user to have the same ID. That would cause all sorts of security problems. But I can't edit it here. We'll have to change that later. I'll take note of the user ID, mgreen, and I could change this if I wanted to. And then I'll choose Create Object. I'll scroll down and choose Commit. And now I can see that in my People group, I have a user. I'll choose the user, and I'll scroll down, and we need to change the UID number. I'll set this one to say 10,001, so it doesn't conflict with the UIDs that exist for my local users. This issue highlights something that you need to consider when you're setting up LDAP access. You can't necessarily just layer LDAP on top of an existing system where there are already users and groups on individual machines. You'll have all kinds of conflicts and security issues. You need to decide which users to move to LDAP and work on your systems to set their user IDs to be consistent, and you need to decide how to set the user ID range on your system for new local accounts so they don't conflict with the range that LDAP is using. You can do this with the usermod-u command. To set up the LDAP software on a client, I'll need to install a few packages. I'll write apt install nscd and LDAP auth client. During the configuration, I'm asked for the Uniform Resource Identifier, or URI, of the LDAP server, and that'll be LDAP://, and in this case, it's the localhost. I'm asked for the distinguished name of the search base, which is our domain in this notation. DC here stands for domain component. So for example.com, I would write DC equals example, DC equals com. We'll choose LDAP version 3, and I'll enable this option here. Here I'll choose no, and for the LDAP root account, I'll add my administrative user, cn equals admin, DC equals example, DC equals com. I'll enter the password for the admin user on the LDAP server, and the installation continues. This adds some configuration to the system's PAM files, so we don't have to do it manually, and gives us an interface to set up some information that the system needs to connect to the LDAP server and check user information. If I need to go through the configuration process again, I can write dpackage reconfigure LDAP auth config, but I won't do that right now. Then I need to edit the nsswitch.conf file for nameservice switch, which contains information about where the system should look for password and group information. I'll write nano etc nsswitch.conf. We're interested in these 3 lines at the top for password, group, and shadow. Right now they're set to compat, which means compatibility mode, and that directs NSS to look for the files on disk when it needs to find out about a user. So it looks at etc password, etc group, and etc shadow when a user tries to log in. We need to add LDAP here as well, because we want our users to be looked up there, not in the local database on the machine. I'll add it after compat here, because we want the system to look in its databases first. If LDAP comes first, and the LDAP server isn't running, it can cause the system to hang at boot, as it looks up the users it needs to start services in a system that doesn't exist yet. I'll save the file. As I mentioned earlier, the libpam LDAP package set up PAM for LDAP for us, and we can take a look at where it's scattered references to LDAP in the PAM files, with grep LDAP etc pam.d. Oops, I need a /* there. These files are managed by the PAM auth update tool. So I'll open that up and see that, yep, LDAP is enabled here. And there's an option for home directories, which is helpful, but it didn't configure the system to create a home folder with our skeleton home folder. That's the one that has a friendly welcome message in it, and we want our LDAP users to have the same experience as our local users. So I'll enable this and choose OK. I'll open up the session settings here with nano etc pam.d common session, and I'll find the home directory line, where PAM is calling the make home directory shared object. I'll add the skeleton folder path here with skel equals etc skel. Great. Now I'll save this and restart the nscd. The name service caching daemon with those changes. And now we're ready to try out our user. I'll switch to another terminal with Ctrl-Alt-F4. And I'll log in as my LDAP user. Their name was mgreen, and I'll type their password. Cool. And with the ID command, I can see that the user ID is in fact 10,001, and the system's created a home directory for me. If I were to take a look at the password file, I'd see that this user is not defined locally, but I'm logged in. That's pretty handy.